In the autumn of 1872, the air in the Blackwood Valley of Montana Territory turned sharp with a promise it could not yet keep. The promise was of winter, of a cleansing cold that would scour the land and lock the world in a silent, white purity. But that year, the purity was a long time coming. The season lingered in a state of damp, unsettled decay. A persistent, cloying warmth held the valley in its grip, turning the creek, the lifeblood of the small settlement of Providence, into a sluggish, brown vein of sickness. They called it the creek fever. It was not a sudden, violent illness that struck a man down in the field. It was a slow thief. It stole the strength from a man's limbs, the warmth from a woman's bones, and the color from a child's cheeks. It was a malaise that settled deep in the gut, a constant draining ache accompanied by a low fever that would not break. The people of Providence, hardy and accustomed to the brutalities of frontier life, found themselves fighting an enemy they could not see, an enemy they drank every single day. The creek was their only source of water. It flowed down from the high peaks, gathering meltwater in spring rains, and for generations it had been considered as pure as the sky above. But the territory was changing. New settlements had sprung up upstream, small mining operations leached minerals from the rock, and more cattle than ever before grazed along its banks. The water that reached Providence was no longer pristine. It carried with it the invisible burdens of progress, the microscopic seeds of suffering. Josiah watched it all. He was a quiet man, his hands stained with the memory of a trade he had left behind in the East. He was a tanner, a man who understood the slow, methodical processes of transformation, of rot and preservation. He saw things others missed. When his neighbors looked at the creek, they saw water, they saw life. When Josiah looked at the creek, he saw a solution in turmoil, a suspension of particles both seen and unseen. He saw the problem not just as a sickness in his family, but as a flaw in the water itself. The accepted wisdom, championed by the town's most respected builder, Silas Croft, was to boil the water. And so, every morning, the valley was wreathed in the smoke of 100 cook fires, each one dedicated to the laborious task of purification. Gallons of water were hauled, fires were fed with precious, hard-won firewood, and the resulting flat, metallic-tasting liquid was cooled and stored. It seemed to help, but it was not a cure. The fever persisted, lurking in the background of their lives, a constant tax on their energy and their resources. But Josiah did not spend his days chopping extra wood. He did something else, something that baffled his neighbors and deeply worried his wife Sarah. He began to walk the edges of the settlement, his eyes cast downward, searching not for herbs or game, but for bones. He collected the bleached skeletons of deer left by wolves, the discarded soup bones from his own kitchen, the remains of cattle that had not survived the previous winter. He gathered them in a wheelbarrow, this grim harvest, and brought them back to a pit he had dug behind his small cabin. The town watched him. They saw him build a great fire in the pit, a fire hotter and more intense than any cook fire. They saw him pile the bones into the roaring flames, where they blackened, smoked, and then began to glow with a strange, incandescent light. He tended this fire for hours, until the bones were no longer bones, but brittle, black charcoal. Then, with a heavy iron mallet, he began the painstaking work of crushing them. He pounded the charred fragments against a flat stone, again and again, reducing them to a coarse black powder, a substance that looked like cursed earth. His neighbors whispered. They called it Josiah's folly. He was a man obsessed with death and decay, they said. He was turning his back on common sense, on the simple, proven method of boiling. He was wasting his time with filth, with the refuse of the wild, while his family was at risk just like everyone else. Why was he collecting trash? Why was he making dirt? Why was this quiet man, this former tanner, spending his precious autumn days engaged in what looked like a bizarre, pointless ritual, filtering his family's future through the ashes of the dead? Why was he filtering water through crushed bones? It's a question that cuts to the heart of how we think about problems. We often trust the established solution, the wisdom of the crowd, because it feels safe. It's what everyone else is doing. But true innovation, the kind that changes the world, often comes from a place of quiet observation. from someone who sees the problem more deeply than anyone else. If you appreciate these stories of forgotten genius and the power of thinking differently, take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It tells us you want more content that digs into the practical wisdom of the past. And let me know in the comments, what's the most basic resource we take for granted today? Is it clean water, electricity, or something else entirely? Because what Josiah was about to build would not only save his family, it would rewrite the rules of survival on the frontier, using a secret locked away in the most unlikely of materials. A secret that would turn the laughter of his neighbors into stunned, desperate silence. Josiah's secret wasn't born of a fevered dream or a sudden stroke of genius. It was rooted in his past, in a trade that was as much art as it was science. Before he had ever swung an axe in Montana, he had spent 2 decades of his life as a master tanner back in Pennsylvania. Tanning is a profession of controlled decay and deliberate purification. It is the process of taking a raw, perishable hide, an object prone to rot and ruin, and transforming it into stable, enduring leather. To do this, a tanner must become an intuitive chemist, a master of potions and processes that few people understood. He had worked with lime to dehair the hides, with tannins from oak bark to preserve them, and with ash to balance the alkalinity of his solutions. He knew, in a way that was second nature to him, how different substances interacted with organic matter. He understood that some materials did not just cover or dilute impurities, they actively seized them, binding with them on a level invisible to the naked eye. He had used charcoal from wood to clarify tanning liquors that had grown cloudy, a common trick of the trade to extend the life of the expensive tannin solution. He had seen with his own eyes how a black, messy powder could pull color and foulness out of a liquid, leaving it clearer than before. This background gave him a unique perspective on the problem of the creek fever. While his neighbors, including the very practical and respected Silas Croft, saw the problem as biological, as invisible germs or miasma that had to be killed with heat. Josiah saw it as both biological and chemical. He had tasted the boiled water. It was flat and carried a faint, unpleasant mineral taste. Sometimes, boiling seemed to concentrate the discoloration, turning slightly murky water into a pale, unappetizing brown broth. He reasoned that killing the germs was only half the battle. The water itself was still sick. It was contaminated with dissolved matter that fire alone could not remove. He had noticed the subtle signs. The way soap didn't lather as well as it should, suggesting the water was hard with minerals. The faint, earthy, almost metallic smell that clung to the water buckets even after they were scrubbed. He suspected runoff from a small, abandoned silver mine a few miles upstream was leaching heavy metals into the creek. He knew the increasing number of cattle upstream meant more organic waste, more nitrates and ammonia dissolving into the water. These were chemical contaminants, not living things. Boiling might kill bacteria, but it would do nothing to remove lead or arsenic or the dissolved organic compounds that gave the water its foul taste and hidden toxicity. In fact, boiling water would slightly increase the concentration of these non-volatile contaminants as some of the water turned to steam. His mind, trained for years to think about purification through chemical means, turned to the most powerful filtering agent he knew, charcoal. But not just any charcoal. Wood charcoal was good, but he remembered an old tanner's tale, a trick used for the finest white leathers, which required water of absolute purity. The old master had spoken of using bone black, a special kind of charcoal made from animal bones, which he claimed could sweeten even the sourest well water. The idea had lodged in his memory, a piece of arcane craft knowledge waiting for the right problem. And so, he began his strange work, not out of madness, but out of a deep, practical understanding that was alien to his neighbors. He built his kiln in the pit to control the airflow, ensuring the bones were heated in a low-oxygen environment. This process, known as pyrolysis, didn't just burn the bones to ash, it carbonized the organic portion of the bone while leaving the mineral structure intact. The result was bone char, a material that was fundamentally different from wood ash. It was a porous matrix of calcium phosphate, riddled with a network of incredibly fine carbon pores. Then came the construction of his filter, the device that would earn the name Josiah's Folly. It was a simple, elegant system, built from 3 large, sturdy oak barrels he had carefully cleaned and prepared. He stacked them vertically on a heavy wooden frame he built next to his cabin's back door. The top barrel was the simplest. It was his settling tank. He would fill it with creek water and let it sit for several hours, allowing the heaviest particles of silt, sand, and clay to settle to the bottom. A small wooden spigot installed a few inches from the bottom allowed him to draw off the top layer of relatively clear water, leaving the sludge behind. This pre-settled water then flowed through a pipe into the second barrel, the heart of his system. This was the filter itself, and he packed it with meticulous care, each layer chosen for a specific purpose. At the bottom, over the outlet pipe, he placed a layer of clean, coarse river stones, about 6 inches deep. Their purpose was to prevent the finer materials above from washing out. On top of the stones, he added another 6 inches of coarse gravel, followed by a foot of clean, fine sand. This part of the filter was not so different from what some other settlers used, a basic sand filter to remove suspended particles. It would clarify the water, but it would not truly purify it. The final top layer was his secret. It was the 2 feet of black, granular bone char he had so painstakingly prepared. This was the chemical engine of his device. As the water percolated down through this layer, something remarkable happened. He was employing a principle modern science calls adsorption. Unlike absorption, where a substance is drawn into the volume of another, like a sponge soaking up water, adsorption is a surface phenomenon. The molecules of the contaminants were physically and chemically drawn to and held upon the massive surface area of the bone char. He couldn't have explained it in the language of a modern chemist, but he understood the result. The activated carbon in the bone char, with its fractal-like network of micropores, was a magnet for organic molecules. It would pull the dissolved organic compounds that caused the bad taste and odor out of the water. It would trap tannins that gave the water its brown color. More importantly, the mineral component of the bone char, the calcium phosphate, had a strong chemical affinity for certain heavy metals, like lead and cadmium, and was uniquely effective at removing fluoride. It was a dual-action filter, both physical and chemical, capable of a level of purification that simple boiling could never hope to achieve. From the second barrel, a small pipe carried the filtered water into the third, bottom barrel. This was the reservoir, a clean, covered tank from which his family would draw their drinking water. The entire system was gravity-fed, a slow, silent, and continuous process. Once he filled the top barrel in the morning, it would drip and trickle its way through the layers, providing a steady supply of purified water throughout the day. It was an elegant solution, born from a deep understanding of a hidden world, a world of chemical bonds and surface tension, a world utterly invisible to the men who leaned against the hitching posts outside the general store, laughing at the mad tanner and his tower of barrels. The laughter started as a low murmur, a few confused glances exchanged between neighbors as Josiah hauled his barrow of bones through the small settlement of Providence. But as the days turned into a week and his strange project took shape, the murmuring grew into open mockery. The structure itself was an offense to their sensibilities. It was ugly, a haphazard-looking tower of old barrels, pipes, and wooden framing that stood in stark contrast to the neat, orderly log cabins that defined their world. It looked like something a man would build in a fever dream, not a practical solution to a serious problem. They called it Josiah's Folly. The name was coined by Jedediah Smith, a farmer whose land bordered Josiah's, and it spread through the town like a grass fire. Men would gather at the general store, the social hub of Providence, and trade jokes at Josiah's expense. "Heard Josiah's making soup for the whole town," one would say. "The secret ingredient is a 10-year-old elk skeleton." Another would chime in. "I saw him out collecting roadkill yesterday. Says it adds a certain flavor to the water." They laughed, the hearty, self-assured laughter of men who believed they understood the world and its simple, unchangeable rules. Water was purified by fire. That was the beginning and the end of it. The children, sensing the adults' derision, were crueler. They would creep to the edge of Josiah's property and chant, "Josiah, Josiah, drinks his water from the fire." before running away, squealing with laughter. A few of the bolder boys took to throwing small stones at the barrels, delighting in the dull thunk it made against the wood, until Josiah's stern, silent gaze sent them scattering. He never yelled, never gave chase. He just stood there, his disappointment more potent than any anger, and watched them go. The social pressure was immense, a suffocating blanket of disapproval. But the most powerful voice against him, the one that gave legitimacy to all the whispers and jokes, belonged to Silas Croft. Croft was more than just a carpenter, he was the architect of Providence. He had designed the town's small but sturdy church, built the bridge over the North Fork of the creek, and had a hand in the construction of nearly every cabin in the valley. He was a man of plumb lines and right angles, of proven techniques and unwavering belief in the traditions of his craft. He saw the world in terms of solid, measurable things, and Josiah's strange alchemy offended his entire worldview. Croft didn't just disapprove, he saw Josiah's filter as a danger. He took it upon himself to warn the community, framing it as his civic duty. He would hold court at the general store or after the Sunday service, his voice booming with authority. "This contraption is an abomination," he declared one afternoon, a small crowd hanging on his every word. "He is taking the filthiest things one can imagine, rotting bones, and claiming to make pure water from them. It defies logic. It defies nature itself. What poison is he creating in those barrels? What sickness will he visit upon his own family by trusting this bone magic over the God-given purity of a rolling boil?" He painted a picture of a man deluded, meddling with forces he did not understand. He called it unnatural and quackery. His pronouncements gave the townspeople license to escalate their scorn. They were no longer just mocking a strange neighbor. They were defending their community from a fool who threatened its well-being. The laughter was now tinged with a self-righteous anger. Josiah was not just odd, he was irresponsible. This constant barrage of ridicule took its heaviest toll not on Josiah, but on his wife Sarah. She was a practical woman who loved her husband and trusted his judgment, but she was not immune to the opinions of her neighbors. The averted gazes of the other women at the market, the sudden silence when she entered the general store, the pitying looks from the pastor's wife, each one was a small cut. She endured the shame for weeks, but as the project neared completion, her anxiety finally boiled over. One evening, as Josiah was fitting the last pipe, she came out to him, her hands twisting in her apron. "Josiah, please," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "Silas Croft was here today. He spoke to me for nearly an hour. He said you will poison the children. He said the whole town thinks you've lost your senses." Her eyes welled with tears. "I see how they look at us. They're laughing at you. They're laughing at us. Can't we just boil the water like everyone else? Is it so important to be different?" The plea in her voice was the single greatest test of his resolve. To see his work causing pain to the person he loved most was a burden far heavier than the town's mockery. He stopped his work and turned to her, wiping his blackened hands on a rag. He looked at her, his face calm and steady in the fading light. He didn't offer a complex explanation of pyrolysis or adsorption. He didn't try to defend his theories against Silas Croft's pronouncements. Instead, he simply took her hand. "Sarah," he said, his voice low and firm, "have I ever led you or the children to harm?" She shook her head, a tear tracing a path through the dust on her cheek. "Trust me in this," he continued, "just a little longer. Let the work speak for itself. The water will be the only answer that matters." His quiet confidence was its own kind of argument, more powerful than any loud defense. He did not engage with the mockers. He did not get into debates with Silas Croft at the store. When Jedediah Smith shouted a joke over the fence, Josiah simply raised a hand in a quiet greeting and continued his task. His silence was infuriating to his critics. It was a wall they could not breach. He offered no fuel for their arguments, no satisfaction of a reaction. He simply worked, his movements precise and deliberate, his focus unwavering. He hammered and sawed and fitted, and with every turn of the screw, every tap of the mallet, he laid another stone in the foundation of his quiet rebellion against the tyranny of conventional wisdom. He would let the water speak for him. The water would be the only answer that matters. And as the last days of October bled into a deceptively warm November, the time for that answer was drawing near. The creek fever had been a persistent, smoldering fire in the community, but it was about to erupt into a raging inferno. The crucible was coming, an event that would test every assumption, every tradition, and every family in the valley. It would be a trial by sickness, and the verdict would be delivered not in words, but in who survived and who suffered. The disaster began with a gift. For the first week of November, a false summer descended on the Blackwood Valley. The air grew warm and humid. The sun beat down with an intensity that belonged to August, and the snow on the high peaks, which should have been settling into a deep winter pack, began to melt with alarming speed. The creek, which had been running low, swelled with this sudden influx of water. But it was not a clean spring melt. This runoff carried with it months of accumulated contamination, the waste from grazing cattle, the tailings from the abandoned mines, the refuse from upstream settlements, all washed down in a single, concentrated wave. Then, just as quickly as it came, the warmth vanished. A blue norther swept down from the Canadian plains, a wall of Arctic air that sent the temperature plummeting 40 degrees in a single afternoon. The sudden, hard freeze locked the valley in a grip of iron. The ground, still saturated from the melt, froze solid. The creek's flow was choked by ice, slowing to a mere trickle. This sequence of events, a sudden flush of contaminants, followed by a sharp drop in water levels, created a perfect storm. The concentration of pollutants in the remaining water skyrocketed. Within 3 days, the creek fever transformed. It was no longer a low-grade malaise. It became a violent, acute sickness that the circuit doctor, a weary man named Miller, quickly identified as dysentery. The disease swept through Providence with terrifying speed. It began with debilitating cramps, followed by a high fever and a bloody flux that left its victims utterly prostrated. Entire families were struck down at once, too weak to even fetch water or feed the fire. The settlement, once a bustling hub of frontier life, fell into a hushed, fearful silence, punctuated only by the sounds of suffering. The conventional wisdom, boiling, now faced its ultimate test, and it began to fail. The process was simply too demanding for a community in crisis. A family of 5 needed several gallons of water a day just for drinking, let alone for cleaning or caring for the sick. Hauling that much water from the icy creek banks was a brutal task. Chopping enough firewood to keep a pot at a rolling boil for the required time was even harder. For those already weakened by the fever, it was an impossible cycle. Men would force themselves out into the killing cold to chop wood, only to collapse from exhaustion and fever upon their return. The boiled water itself offered little comfort. It did nothing to remove the foul, swampy taste of the concentrated creek water. For those racked with nausea, forcing down the tepid, unpleasant liquid was an ordeal. Some began to suspect the water was the problem, boiled or not, but they had no alternative. They were trapped, forced to drink the very substance that was poisoning them. Silas Croft, the champion of boiling, was not spared. His wife was among the first to fall seriously ill, and soon his youngest son, a boy of 7 named Thomas, was also in the grip of a violent fever. Croft, a man of immense physical strength and unwavering self-confidence, found himself helpless. He spent his days and nights hauling wood and water, his broad shoulders slumped in exhaustion and fear. The simple, proven method he had preached with such certainty was failing his own family. But on the small homestead at the edge of town, a different reality was unfolding. Josiah's family remained an island of health in a sea of sickness. His 2 children played in the yard, their laughter a stark contrast to the grim silence that had fallen over the rest of Providence. His wife Sarah moved about her chores with energy, her face free from the fear that haunted her neighbors. They were not touched by the sickness, not even a hint of it. Their secret dripped slowly, steadily, from the bottom barrel of Josiah's folly. The water that emerged from the filter was not just boiled, it was transformed. It was crystal clear, with a brilliance that seemed impossible. It had no color, no smell, and no taste other than the clean, crisp essence of pure water. It was cold and refreshing, drawn from the covered reservoir, a stark contrast to the flat, warm water the rest of the town was choking down. Josiah's system required no fire, no constant tending. He simply filled the top barrel twice a day, a task that took him mere minutes, and the silent, gravity-fed process did the rest. While his neighbors exhausted themselves in a desperate, losing battle, Josiah's family had an endless supply of pristine water with almost no effort. The contrast became too stark to ignore. Neighbors, peering from their sickbeds, saw Josiah's children playing, saw the smoke rising calmly from his chimney, a sign of a normal, functioning household, not the frantic, all-consuming fires of boiling. The whispers began to change. The mockery was replaced by a fearful, confused curiosity. How was it possible that the one family who defied common sense was the only family to be spared? The moment of truth came on the 5th night of the outbreak. Silas Croft's son, Thomas, had taken a turn for the worse. His fever was dangerously high, and he had fallen into a state of delirium. Dr. Miller had been to the house and had left with a grim shake of his head, offering nothing but condolences. He had seen too many children slip away in the same manner. Croft was a broken man. He sat by his son's bedside, watching his small chest heave, his own heart consumed by a terror he had never known. He had done everything right. He had followed the rules. He had boiled every drop of water, and his son was dying. In the depths of his despair, a desperate, humbling thought took root. He looked at the pail of boiled water, its brownish tinge and foul smell seeming to mock him. He thought of Josiah. He thought of the laughter, the scorn, the public denunciations he himself had led. And he thought of the rumors of Josiah's healthy children. Pride wrestled with desperation, but the image of his son's pale face was the deciding factor. Humiliation was a small price to pay for even a sliver of hope. He pulled on his coat and stumbled out into the frigid night. He made his way through the darkened town to the edge of Josiah's property, a supplicant approaching a shrine he had once defiled. He didn't know what he would say, what he would ask for. He expected to have to beg, to plead, to endure the righteous anger of a man he had wronged. Instead, he found Josiah outside, calmly drawing a pail of water from the spigot of the bottom barrel. The filter stood silent and unassuming in the moonlight, a strange tower that now seemed less like folly and more like an ark. Josiah looked up and saw him, his expression unreadable. There was no triumph in his eyes, no hint of, "I told you so." He simply nodded, as if expecting him. Croft's throat was dry. He couldn't form the words to ask. He didn't have to. Josiah lifted a clean dipper from a hook on the side of the barrel, filled it with the sparkling water, and held it out. It was a simple, silent offer. For a long moment, Croft just stared at it. This was the water he had called poison, the product of a madman's obsession. To drink it felt like an admission of utter defeat. But then he looked back towards his own dark, silent cabin, where his son lay dying. He took the dipper. His hand trembled as he brought it to his lips. He drank. The water was shockingly cold, pure, and clean. It was like drinking from a high mountain spring, a taste he had not experienced in months. It had a substance, a vitality, that the boiled water utterly lacked. In that single moment, all his certainty, all his pride, all his rigid belief in the conventional way, shattered. He saw Josiah's healthy children watching from the cabin window, their faces pressed against the glass. He saw the simple, undeniable truth. He had been wrong. Terribly, catastrophically wrong. He drained the dipper, the pure, cold water, a baptism of humility, and looked at the quiet tanner with the eyes of a man reborn. The eyes of the first convert. In the days that followed, the story of Silas Croft's midnight visit spread through the ravaged community. It was not a story of triumph or defeat, but of quiet, desperate hope. Croft, a man whose pride was as solid as the oak he built with, became the filter's most fervent advocate. He did not just fetch water for his own family. He began a methodical, almost scientific documentation of the filter's effects. His mind, accustomed to precision and measurement, turned from ridicule to analysis. He sat with Josiah, a pen and paper in hand, and for the first time asked not with scorn, but with genuine curiosity, how the device worked. He recorded the details of its construction, the layers of stone, sand, and the crucial bone char. He then began to gather data, to quantify the miracle that he had witnessed. The first and most dramatic statistic was the consumption of firewood. Croft calculated that his own household, in its frantic effort to boil every drop of water, had been consuming nearly a quarter of a cord of wood per week, an unsustainable rate that was mirrored across Providence. Families were depleting their winter stores at an alarming pace. Josiah's household, in contrast, used wood only for heating and cooking. His water purification was powered by gravity, a silent, tireless engine. The savings were staggering, representing not just fuel, but the time and energy of a populace that had neither to spare. The filter offered not just clean water, but the gift of rest. Next, Croft turned his attention to the health of the community, creating a grim ledger of the outbreak. He went door to door, his presence now a comfort rather than a judgment. He recorded the numbers. Of the 34 households in the valley, 33 had been struck by the dysentery. In those 33 homes, nearly 80% of the inhabitants, a total of 127 men, women, and children, had fallen ill. 17 had already died, most of them the very young or the very old. The only household to remain completely untouched was Josiah's. 0 cases. The number was stark, absolute, and irrefutable. It was a data point that silenced all remaining doubt. Dr. Miller, who had initially dismissed the filter as irrelevant, became a key ally. He took samples of the raw creek water, the boiled water, and the water from Josiah's filter. Lacking a microscope, he performed the simple sensory tests available to him. The creek water was visibly cloudy and smelled of decay. The boiled water was clearer but retained a foul, metallic taste. The filtered water was pristine on all counts. He began prescribing it to his sickest patients. He told them, "Stop drinking the boiled water, get water from Josiah." The results were almost immediate. Those who drank the filtered water began to recover. Their fevers broke, their strength slowly returned. The pure water rehydrated them without introducing more contaminants, allowing their bodies to finally heal. The ultimate vindication came at the next town meeting, held in the church that Silas Croft himself had built. It was a somber gathering, the pews filled with the grieving and the convalescing. When the time came for community business, Croft walked to the front, his face etched with a gravity no one had ever seen in him before. He turned to face his neighbors, the people who had followed his lead and trusted his judgment. "I have something to say," he began, his voice echoing in the silent hall. "For weeks, many of us, myself included, have mocked a good man for his ingenuity. We have called his work folly. We have laughed at him, and we have shunned his family." He paused, and his gaze found Josiah, who was sitting quietly in the back pew with Sarah. "I am here today to say that I was wrong. My pride, my belief that I knew best, has cost this town dearly. I championed a solution that was incomplete, and I condemned the one that was perfect." He then laid out the facts, the numbers, the stark reality of their suffering versus Josiah's health. He spoke not as a carpenter, but as a convert. "That device," he said, pointing out the church door towards Josiah's cabin, "is not Josiah's folly. It is the Providence filter, and it is the most important piece of engineering this valley has ever seen. It saved my son's life, and it can save all of us." He then turned directly to Josiah. "Josiah," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I ask for your forgiveness, and I ask for your help." The intellectual redemption was complete. The town's expert had not only admitted his error, he had become the champion of the very idea he had sought to destroy. The tide of public opinion turned in an instant. The mockery and suspicion were washed away by a flood of desperate need. After the meeting, men did not run from Josiah, they crowded around him. They did not come with jokes, but with hats in their hands and humility in their hearts. "Can you show me?" they asked, one after another. "Can you teach me how to build one?" Josiah, a man of few words, simply nodded. He held no grudges, he delivered no lectures on their past foolishness. The next morning, he walked over to Silas Croft's homestead, and together, the tanner and the carpenter, the innovator and the expert, began to build the second Providence filter. They worked side by side, a silent partnership of shared purpose. Soon, the sound of hammering and sawing echoed throughout the valley as dozens of men, armed with Josiah's knowledge and Croft's building expertise, began constructing their own filters. Within a month, nearly every home had one. The dysentery outbreak, which had crippled the town, vanished. The Providence filter changed the Blackwood Valley forever. It became a standard feature of every homestead, as essential as the hearth or the well. The general health of the community improved dramatically. The low-grade creek fever that had plagued them for years disappeared entirely. Infant mortality, once tragically high, began to decline. The people of Providence were not just healthier, they were more resilient. They were no longer slaves to the daily, time-consuming ritual of boiling water, their time and energy freed up for the countless other tasks of frontier survival. Word of the filter spread. Trappers and traders passing through Providence saw the strange barrel towers and tasted the remarkably pure water. They carried the story and the design to other settlements. The idea was simple, the materials were readily available, and the results were undeniable. The bone filter, as it came to be known in other territories, was a piece of practical, life-saving technology that quietly proliferated across the West. It was an innovation born of one man's unique experience, tested in a crucible of sickness, and proven by undeniable results. The legacy of Josiah's work extends even to the present day. The principle he harnessed, adsorption using activated carbon, is the cornerstone of modern water filtration. The filter in your refrigerator, the pitcher on your kitchen counter, the massive municipal water treatment plants that serve millions of people, they all owe a debt to this fundamental concept. While modern activated carbon is typically made from coconut shells or coal for greater efficiency and purity, the underlying science is the same one that the quiet tanner understood intuitively. Bone char itself is still used today in very specific high-value applications. For decades, it has been a critical component in the refining of cane sugar, used to decolorize the sugar syrup and produce the pure white crystals we know today. It is also recognized as one of the most effective substances for removing fluoride from drinking water, a specialized application where it still outperforms many newer technologies. Josiah's folly was not some crude temporary fix. It was a robust, effective technology that tapped into timeless principles of chemistry and physics, a forgotten piece of wisdom that demonstrates how the most profound solutions can be found in the most humble of materials. It was a testament to the power of looking at the world with fresh eyes, of challenging the comforting tyranny of what everyone else believes to be true. In the end, the story of Josiah and his filter is not really about barrels and bones. It's about the nature of wisdom itself. It teaches us that true expertise isn't always accompanied by a loud voice or a confident title. Sometimes it resides in the quiet hands of a person with a different perspective, a person who has learned to observe the world so closely that they see the hidden machinery beneath the surface. It's a powerful reminder that conventional wisdom is only conventional. It is not always wise. The greatest breakthroughs often come when one person is brave enough to ignore the laughter of the crowd and trust what their own experience, their own reason, and their own two hands have taught them. They trust the work, and they wait, patiently, for the water to provide the only answer that matters. If this story of forgotten wisdom and quiet perseverance resonated with you, and you want to see more deep dives into the practical genius of the past, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss a new exploration. We believe these stories hold valuable lessons for our modern world, and I want to know your thoughts. What other piece of old-fashioned technology do you think is superior to its modern equivalent? Is it a cast iron skillet, a straight razor, a mechanical watch? Drop a comment below. I read every single one of them and love learning from your perspectives. Thank you for watching. Disclaimer. This content is for educational and entertainment purposes only. The characters, names, and specific events depicted in this narrative are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. However, the technical principles of bone char filtration and its historical use are based on factual practices and scientific concepts. The construction and use of any water filtration system today should be done in consultation with modern sanitation experts and must comply with all local health and safety regulations and building codes. Do not attempt to replicate historical processes without professional guidance and a thorough understanding of modern material safety.